Hey everybody, welcome back to History Student Reacts. Today we'll be watching the 5 most disastrous accounts of first contact in history by voices of the past. Now this channel and this video in particular have been recommended to me a couple of times. I think it's a really interesting topic, though of course this video itself is quite broad. I'm unfamiliar with this channel, but to my understanding, what they do is they take sources, texts from the past, and they put them on display in their videos, which I think is really interesting and important. It's always good to showcase the primary sources that we have. So I'm excited to get into this video. If you guys end up enjoying this one, I would appreciate it if you would check out my Patreon, which is linked down below, and will give you access to exclusive content. Anyway, with all of that out of the way, let's jump right into this reaction.
The seed and origin of all the ruin and various disasters, putting in turmoil all places with unwanted fires, we have found to be this.
Okay. And I think before we get into this source, we should take a look at the man who actually wrote it. Alright, so I've done a bit of light Googling, very, very light. We have our boy Ammianus Marcellinus. He appears to have lived from about 330 to around the year 400, so we're talking rather late Roman Empire, at least late Western Roman Empire. He was a soldier and historian. He served both in Gaul and the East under Constantius II and Julian the Apostate, some interesting fellas. So this is the time period he's living in. We're talking sort of mid to late 300s. Keep in mind the time period, what's going on around him. The Western Roman Empire is losing authority, losing power. It is on the decline at this point. He has served militarily, been on many campaigns. Basically, this is the perspective that Ammianus is coming from when writing about the Huns. Alright, so back to his actual writing.
Putting in turmoil all places with unwanted fires, we have found to be this. The people of the Huns, but little known from ancient records, dwelling beyond the Maotic Sea near the icebound ocean, exceeding every degree of savagery. The cheeks of the children deeply furrowed with the steel from their very birth, in order that the growth of hair, when it appears at the proper time, may be checked by the wrinkled scars. They grow old without beards and without any beauty, like eunuchs. They all have compact, strong limbs and thick necks, and are so monstrously ugly and misshapen that one might take them for two-legged beasts. Although they have the form of men, however ugly, they are so hardy in their mode of life that they have no need of fire, nor of savory food, but eat the roots of wild plants and the half-raw flesh of any kind of animal whatsoever.
Right, and so once again, remember the perspective that Ammianus is coming from. He's coming from a Roman perspective. So first off, you can tell that he is definitely fearful of the Huns. He sees them as something closer to beasts, clearly recognizing their military potential. Also remember that the Romans were very arrogant and full of themselves. They saw almost everybody else as barbarians, so they were not particularly kind in their descriptions of other peoples. So you're definitely getting all of that from this description, but what you're also getting is that clearly the Huns were a martial people, a powerful people, a people whose military prowess was to be feared.
Which they put between their thighs and the backs of their horses, and thus warm it a little. They are never protected by any buildings, but they avoid these like tombs. Roaming at large amid the mountains and woods, they learn from the cradle to endure cold, hunger, and thirst. No one in their country ever plows a field or touches a plow handle. None of their offspring, when asked, can tell you where he comes from, since he was conceived in one place, born far from there, and brought up still further away. So when the report spread widely among the other Gothic peoples that a race of men hitherto unknown had now arisen from a hidden nook of the earth, like a tempest of snows from the high mountains, and was seizing or destroying everything in its...
Okay, and so this description we can see, first off, a description of the Huns as basically nomadic. Ammianus saying they avoid buildings, right? They live this nomadic lifestyle. And also you're getting a sense of, of the peoples in the area, the peoples of Europe, how quickly they felt that the Huns sort of leapt onto the scene. Everything was fine, or, well, everything wasn't fine, but Europe was Hunless, and then all of a sudden, bam, the Huns are riding in from the east. You're sort of getting that impression from this source as well.
Way, the greater part of the people, looking for a home removed from all knowledge of the savages, and after long deliberation what abode to choose, they thought that Thrace offered them a convenient refuge.
Though I will say, we know that Ammianus died around the year 400, so after he died, the Huns would move even further westward. They would become even more present in the lives of a lot of the peoples of Europe, in the lives of the Romans themselves.
But the Goths joined with the Huns and the Helani, exceedingly warlike and brave peoples hardened to the difficulties of severe toils, and set up their camp near Perinthus, and reduced to utter ruin the fertile fields which extended far and wide about it, killing or capturing those who dwelt there. From there, they hastened in rapid march to Constantinople, greedy for its vast heaps of treasure, marching in square formations for fear of ambushes, and intending to make many mighty efforts to destroy the famous city. But as they went on, their courage was broken when they beheld the oblong circuit of the walls, the blocks of houses covering a vast space, the beauties of the city beyond their reach, the vast population inhabiting it, and the strait nearby that separates the Pontus from the Aegean. So the Goths destroyed the factories of warlike materials which they were preparing, and after suffering greater losses than they had inflicted, they then departed, and spread everywhere over the northern provinces.
Interesting. So now we're getting that bit of an alliance between the Huns and the Goths. Of course, the Goths themselves would become a major menace to Rome throughout the years, as we're seeing here, and after the fall of the West, the Goths would inhabit and rule many of the lands once ruled by the Roman Empire, the Ostrogoths, the Visigoths. So we're sort of seeing some of that here.
In war, events of importance are the result of trivial causes. So said Julius Caesar. Misunderstandings when two cultures meet for the first time can quickly turn to battle. And so our sponsor today is War Thunder, the most comprehensive vehicle combat game out there, and one that transports you back in time to battles from the 1920s to the present day with a choice of more than 2,000 super detailed tanks, planes, helicopters and ships, placing you in frantic player versus player action. It's available on PC, Xbox Series X and S, PS5 and previous generations, and whether you want a super accurate simulation or some wild fun, there are loads of immersion levels available. My personal favourite part is how customizable the vehicles are. I've been enjoying immersing myself in the different time periods and the thousands of different customizations on offer. Join me as I crash my favourite Spitfire again and again and receive a free bonus pack with a premium account, vehicles, boosters and lots more by clicking on the link in the description. Thanks to War Thunder for supporting history content on YouTube.
Alright, go do that, guys. Go use their link. Ooh. Okay.
A few days.
Now we're going to take a look at this source before we hear it. Alright, so the Chronica Mexicana. We're talking about a history of the Aztecs, written by the Aztecs themselves. It seems to have been written around the 16th century. There's a lot of ambiguity. We don't exactly know when it was written. There seems to be some contention over exactly who wrote it. But basically, we're getting an Aztec perspective on Aztec history, and in this case, the arrival of the Spaniards. So keep that in mind. That's what we're hearing here.
Days later, a common man came to the city from Mictlanhuatla. No one had sent him, none of the officials. He came of his own accord. He went directly to the palace of Moctezuma and said to him, "Our lord and king, forgive my boldness. I am from Mictlanhuatla. When I went to the shores of the Great Sea, there was a mountain range, or small mountain floating in the midst of the water, moving here and there without touching the shore. My lord, we have never seen the like of this, although we guard the coast and are always on watch." Moctezuma thanked him and said, "You may rest now." The man who brought the news had no ears, for they had been cut off, and no toes, for they had also been cut off. Moctezuma said, "Take him to the prison and guard him well." Then he called for a priest and appointed him his grand emissary. He said to him, "Go to Quetzalcoatl and tell the official in charge of the village that it is true. Strange things have appeared in the Great Sea. Tell him to investigate these things himself."
This is very interesting. So we're getting an understanding that I suppose the Aztecs didn't exactly know what they were seeing when the Spaniards arrived. Of course, there had been Europeans in the New World since, good old Columbus in 1492. But, the Europeans are slowly moving further inwards, further inland. Of course, when the Europeans first arrived, they did a bit of island hopping. That's what Columbus did. But as time goes on, it's now been a couple of decades. Not that long, but enough time that the Europeans have started to move further inwards. And now they're encountering this Aztec empire, this great and powerful empire. And of course, the Aztecs are encountering the Spaniards and don't entirely seem to know exactly what they're dealing with.
To learn what they may signify, tell him to do this as quickly as he can and take the ambassador with you. When they arrived, the envoys spoke with the official in charge there, a man named Pinotl. He listened to them with great attention and then said, "My lords, rest here with me and send your attendants out to the shore." The attendants went out and came back in great haste to report that it was true. They had seen 2 towers or small mountains floating on the waves of the sea. The Grand Emissary said to Pinotl, "I wish to see these things in person in order to learn what they are, for I must testify to our Lord as an eyewitness."
So this suggests that these Spanish ships were larger than anything these people had ever seen. So I'm curious. The Aztecs must have had ships of their own. I'm not exactly sure what they used. We think about the native peoples of the Americas. We know there was a lot of light ships being used, stuff like canoes, but I think that maybe in a more North American context, I'm not, or, by North American, I mean in what would today be sort of present-day United States and Canada. I'm not entirely sure what the Aztecs would have used. Like I said, this suggests that these ships were more monumental than anything they'd ever seen before, but I'm not sure how that would compare to what exactly they were using.
I will be satisfied with this and will report to him exactly what I see. Therefore he went out to the shore, and they saw what was floating there beyond the edges of the water. They also saw that 7 or 8 of the strangers had left in a small boat and were fishing with hooks and lines. The Grand Emissary climbed up into a broad-limbed tree. From there he saw how the strangers were catching fish and how, when they were done, they returned to the ship in their small boat. They returned as swiftly as possible to the great city of Tenochtitlan and reported to Moctezuma what they had observed. "Our Lord and King, it is true that strange people have come to the shores of the Great Sea. They were fishing from a small boat, some with rods and others with a net. They fished until late, and then they went back to their 2 great towers and climbed up into them. There are about 15 of these people, some with blue jackets, others with red, others with black or green, and still others with jackets of a soiled colour, very ugly. There are also a few without jackets. On their heads they wore red handkerchiefs or bonnets of a fine scarlet colour, and some wore large round hats, which must have been sunshades. They have very light skin, much lighter than ours. They all have long beards, and their hair only comes to their ears."
It's very interesting to see these observations, because through these observations we can make assumptions about the Aztecs, the native peoples, and their culture. So when they talk about how big the ships are, we're thinking, okay, so this must be bigger than anything they've seen. When they talk about, well, they have very light skin, much lighter than ours, okay, that's a direct reference, a direct comparison. They have long beards, and their hair comes only to their ears. That might suggest that perhaps the Aztecs had longer hair, and maybe beards were less popular, or maybe not. But it's sort of interesting the things that this source is pointing out, the descriptors they're using for these Spaniards.
Moctezuma was downcast when he heard this report and did not speak.
Although good old Montezuma is sporting a fine beard, at least in that image. I'm not sure if he actually was bearded or I know there's a lot of ambiguity over a lot of this history, so I'm not entirely sure.
Word. In my other account, most excellent prince...
Okay, well, we actually don't need to look into this one because the title is very self-explanatory. Cortez, Hernan Cortez, one of the conquistadors who sort of spearheaded this mission, if you want to call it that, his letter to Emperor Charles V in 1520. There we go, we have the context. Not to mention, we just got sort of the Aztec perspective, now we're getting the European perspective.
I told your majesty of all the cities and towns which until then had offered themselves to your royal service, and which I held subjugated and conquered for you. I also mentioned that I had information of a great lord called Montezuma, of whom the natives of this country had told me, and who lived, according to their computation of distances, about 90 or 100 leagues from the coast and port where I had disembarked, and that, confiding in the greatness of God and relying to the power of your highness's royal name, I had decided to go and see him, wherever he might be. I even remember that I offered to accomplish the impossible, for I vowed to your royal highness that I would have him prisoner, or dead, or subject to the royal crown of your majesty.
Uh-oh.
About 1,000 of the principal citizens came out to meet me from the city and speak to me, all richly dressed alike according to their fashion. There is a wooden bridge 10 paces broad in the very outskirts of the city, across an opening in the causeway where the water may flow in and out as it rises and falls. Having passed this bridge, we were received by that lord, Montezuma, with about 200 chiefs, all barefooted and dressed in a kind of livery, very rich according to their custom.
Yes, I'm very interested to see this account because, we're talking about, these Europeans coming into contact with a great empire. They really are. Now, of course, there was a lot of accounts of first contact between European settlers, and I say European because if we're talking more broadly, well, in the grand scheme, there's Portuguese settlers, there's Spanish, later on there's French and English. A lot of European settlers show up in the New World. Of course, mostly Spaniards in this case, though it wasn't only Spaniards that went along in these Spanish missions. But anyway, there's lots of different examples of first contact, and sometimes they went better than others. There were differences between them. Sometimes you might just be encountering a small native tribe, maybe a bigger confederation. In this case, a whole empire. A pretty powerful empire with a lot of wealth, impressive to some extent to these conquistadors. But, of course, the real remarkable thing about Hernan Cortez and his, mission is that this basically led to the fall of the Aztec Empire. I mean, everything started to crumble. So, really a remarkable change in the region just from the arrival of these outsiders.
And some more than others. They approached in 2 processions near the walls of the street, which is very broad and straight and beautiful, and very uniform from one end to the other, being about 2/3 of a league long, and having on both sides very large houses, both dwelling places and mosques. Montezuma came in the middle of the street with 2 lords, one on the right side and the other on the left. All were dressed in the same manner, except that Montezuma was shod, and the other lords were barefoot. Each supported him below his arms, and as we approached each other, I descended from my horse and was about to embrace him, but the 2 lords in attendance prevented me with their hands, that I might not touch him, and they, and he also, made the ceremony of kissing the ground. We went on through the streets until we came to a large and handsome house, which he had prepared for our reception. There he took me by the hand and led me to a spacious room, in front of the court where we had entered, where he made me sit on a very rich platform. We have known for a long time, from the chronicles of our forefathers, that neither I nor those who inhabit this country are descendants from the aborigines of it, but from strangers who came to it from very distant parts. And we also hold that our race was brought to these parts by a lord, whose vassals they all were, and who returned to his native country. and we have always held that those who descended from him would come to subjugate this country and us as his vassals. And according to the direction from which you say you come, which is where the sun rises, and from what you tell us of your great lord or king who has sent you here, we believe and hold for certain that he is our rightful sovereign, especially as you tell us that since many days he has had news of us. Since you are in your rightful place and in your own homes, rejoice and rest, free from all the trouble of the journey and wars which you have had. Do not believe more than you see with your own eyes, especially from those who are my enemies and were my vassals, yet rebelled against me on your coming, as they say, in order to help you.
Yeah, we've got some real interesting stuff going on here. So from my understanding, the Spaniards were initially received well by Montezuma, by, the leadership of the Aztec Empire, and we're sort of seeing it described here. Why exactly? But this Aztec Empire was a real complex system. Now, this is not my area of expertise. Some of you who know more about it could tell me in the comments below, but, the Aztecs had subjugated a lot of other peoples of the region. They had a lot of different peoples paying tribute to them, to their government, to their empire. And so, it was a complex situation, rebellions with any sort of big empire, especially one that functions like that. There could be rebellions brewing, there could be revolutions, there could be this, there could be that. And so, and by the way, this is one of the things that the Spaniards would take advantage of in order to complete their conquest, but basically a real complex political situation. But, like I said, as we can see, Montezuma is sort of welcoming these Spaniards in, rolling out the red carpet, so to speak, saying, hey, you're welcome here. And obviously things will go in a different direction, but it is interesting to see how everything kicks off.
I know that they have told you that I have houses with walls of gold, and that the furniture of my halls and the other things of my service were also of gold, and that I am, or make myself, a god, and many other things. The houses you have seen are of lime, and stone, and earth. And then he held up his robes, and showing me his body, he said to me, look at me, and see that I am flesh and bones, the same as you, and everybody, and that I am mortal and tangible. And touching his arms and body with his hands, look how they have lied to you.
Wow.
I answered to all he said, certifying that which seemed to be suitable. After this, he took his leave, and when he had gone, we were well provided with chickens and bread.
What a remarkable interaction, by the way. Literally asking to touch him. I am flesh and bone. See me here. That is all I am, same as you. Very interesting.
Bread and fruits and other necessities, especially such as were required. Thus I passed 6 days well provided with everything necessary, and visited by many of the lords.
Right.
6 days having passed, most invincible prince, after I had arrived in the city of Tenochtitlan, and having seen something of it, although little in proportion to the amount there is to be seen and noted, it appeared to me, even from what I had seen of it and the country, that it would be conducive to your royal highness's service, and to our security, that Montezuma should be in my power, and not at his entire liberty, so that he might not relax his intention and disposition to serve your highness.
And here we go. Like I said, you can learn a lot of things from these sources. You can learn, of course, about the people being written about, because all of these sources are people writing about other peoples. But you can also learn a lot about the people doing the writing, There's a lot of assumptions to be made. Now, of course, assumptions have to be backed up by evidence, but there's a lot of things we can sort of parse out. And you can see the intent of Cortez. And we're talking about Cortez in particular, of course, but a lot of this was broadly true for many conquistadors. He is there on behalf of his king. He wants to conquer, he wants to win wealth and glory for his king and for himself, right? But, he would say for his king and country. And so even though Montezuma is greeting him very well, rolling out the red carpet, giving him the honors I'm sure Cortez feels like he deserves, Cortez is still thinking, okay, we need to bring this guy under our control somehow, subjugate him somehow. Now, he's not necessarily saying, to go the full way, but he's saying we need some control over this fella so he can serve you, the king, properly. And, like I said, this was the goal of a lot of these conquistadors who came to the Americas, regardless of how they were treated by the natives when they arrived. Because like I said, sometimes they would run into a native tribe who was instantly hostile. Sometimes things would be more neutral. Maybe an alliance could be worked out. Sometimes the Europeans were welcomed. They were fed. They were put up in homes, whatever. So it's an interesting situation, and here we're seeing sort of the different perspective from several different angles.
I thought this, especially because we Spaniards are somewhat touchy and importunate, and if he should happen to become angry, he could do us such injury with his great power that there would remain no recollection of us.
And, Cortez is correct in that right now, though the Spaniards are being welcomed, they're being treated very well, it's all due to the will of Montezuma. And if he decided that, well, we're not going to do this anymore, we don't want to welcome these people into our country, then the Spaniards would be in trouble. So if, he's trying to establish himself, establish royal power, then, yeah, Cortez knows sort of what he has to do.
And so I determined to seize him and confine him in my quarters, which are very strong. I stationed sufficient guards on the cross streets and went to the palace of Montezuma, as I had at other times gone to see him, and after conversing with him lightly on pleasant subjects, and after he had given me some valuables in gold and one of his daughters, and some daughters of other lords to some of my companions, I told him that I had learnt of what had happened in the city of Nautacal, or Almeria, and about the Spaniards whom they had killed there, and that Qualpopoca gave them his excuse that all he had done had been by Montezuma's order, and that, as his vessel, he could not have done otherwise. I said that he ought to send for him and the other chiefs who had helped him in the murder of the Spaniards, so that the truth might be known, and they be punished, and your majesty might clearly perceive his good disposition. Otherwise, the reports of these wicked men might provoke your highness to anger against him, from which, instead of the favours your highness would now grant him, evil would result, for I was convinced that the truth was contrary to what they declared. He immediately sent for certain of his people, to whom he gave a small stone figure, like a seal, which he wore tied to his arm, ordering them to go to the city of Almeria, which is about 60 or 70 leagues from that of Muxtitan, and bring the said Qualpopoca. These men immediately left, and after they had gone, I told Montezuma that I was very grateful to him for the diligence he had used in the imprisonment of these men.
It is really interesting, just how welcoming Montezuma is being to Cortez. He is really accepting everything Cortez asks of him. He's welcoming him in, giving him gifts, all of these riches, putting him up, feeding him. And then Cortez comes and says, well, you've done this to the Spaniards. You should go and investigate this, find the truth. And Montezuma says, okay, we shall do that. Now, we kind of got a description of the relationship between the two sides earlier, which might explain it, but it is sort of interesting still.
For I must render an account to your royal highness for those murdered Spaniards. To enable me to give this, it now only remained that he should stop in my quarters until the truth was established, and it was known that he was blameless. I earnestly prayed him not to feel pained at this, because he would not be kept a prisoner, but would have entire liberty, well assured that he should suffer no annoyance or unpleasantness.
I believe that is about as much as when you told it to Montezuma, my friend. It is also, once again, real remarkable that Cortez shows up with, like I said, I don't know much about this event. I couldn't tell you the size of the Spanish contingent, but I would imagine a relatively small number of men. He waltzes in there, gets treated like a visiting king, basically, and then seizes Montezuma, seizes the king, the emperor of this great empire. It's truly amazing how quickly he goes right to the top, and then it's truly amazing how quickly everything crumbles. This whole Aztec empire.
But rather that, in addition to his own attendants, my companions would also obey his commands. We had much conversation and argument about this, which would be too lengthy to write as well as little bearing on the case. Hence, I will not say more than that he finally agreed to come with me. Thus, we went to my quarters without causing any commotion in the city, although some had begun, but when Montezuma heard of it, he ordered it to be stopped, and thus all was completely quiet, as though nothing had happened. And this continued all the time I kept Montezuma prisoner. Those who had been sent for Qualpopoca and the others who had killed the Spaniards returned, bringing the said Qualpopoca and one of his sons, and with them 15 other persons, and afterwards they confessed that they had killed the Spaniards. And so I had them interrogated as to whether they were vassals of Montezuma. Qualpopoca answered, asking if there existed any other lord of whom he might be vassal, as much as to say there was no other. I likewise asked them if what had been done there was by Montezuma's order, and they answered, no. When the sentence that they should be burned was carried into execution, all with one voice said it was true that Montezuma had ordered them to do it, and that they had obeyed his command.
Yeah, it seems like these guys are sort of vacillating back and forth, to be honest with you. We're getting different answers at different times. I'm not entirely sure Montezuma was actually involved in this. Plus, once again, the Spaniards just waltz in there, basically set up their own court. They're running things now, you know? They're doing whatever they want. They're interrogating people, executing people, no regard for the sovereignty, if there was any sovereignty of the Aztec Empire. They're just doing their own thing completely.
So they were burned publicly, in one of the squares, without occasioning any commotion, and the day when they were burned, as soon as they confessed that Montezuma commanded them to kill the Spaniards, I ordered him to be put in chains.
Yeah, I would say that is a confession under duress. You know what I mean? I wouldn't necessarily take that as truth. Of course, we know that the Spaniards, Cortez, is just fishing for what he wants to hear. You know, he cares not for the truth of the situation. He's just trying to get what he needs so that he can have some justification to do what he wants. Now, he doesn't really need the justification. He's already been doing exactly what he wants. But now that he has it, well, he doesn't have to have any regard for Montezuma anymore.
Which frightened him.
Alright, once again, one that we'll have to look into. Alright, so here we have Abel Jansun Tasman. Not sure if I'm pronouncing that correctly. If not, I apologize. He was a Dutch explorer and merchant in the employ of the Dutch East India Company. He took several voyages, one of which we're seeing here in 1642 to New Zealand, also to Fiji and Tasmania. And as you might be able to tell from the name, Tasmania was later named after him. So, once again, sort of fairly typical European explorer under the employ in one of these new joint stock companies, but in this case, a Dutchman. We were talking about the Spaniards this time, now we talk about the Dutch and the Maori of New Zealand. Let's get into it.
13th of December. Towards noon, we saw a large, high-lying land, bearing southeast of us at about 15 miles distance. We turned our course to the southeast, making straight for this land. We were about 2 miles off the coast, which showed us a very high, double land, but we could not see the summits of the mountains owing to the clouds. 18th of December. At sunset, when it fell calm, we dropped anchor. About an hour after sunset, we saw a number of lights on shore and 4 boats close inshore, 2 of which came towards us. The men in the 2 prows began to call out to us in a rough, hollow voice, but we could not understand a word of what they said. We, however, called out to them in answer, upon which they repeated their cries several times, but came no nearer than a stone shot. They also blew several times on an instrument of which the sound was like that of a Moorish trumpet. We then ordered one of our sailors, who had knowledge of trumpet blowing, to play them some tunes in answer. Those on board the Zeehan ordered their second mate, who had come out to India as a trumpeter, to do the same.
Yeah, and this is going to be a real interesting one because I'm not sure if they would be able to understand each other at all. Of course, this is first contact, and in some other instances of first contact, you might have an interpreter, because, say, if we look at the New World of the Americas, Even if you hadn't come into contact with, say, this particular tribe, well, maybe you knew another particular tribe and they had a similar language or the same language, or maybe there was an interpreter who could interpret between your European language and their native language. But in this case, I'm not sure if there would have been any way to communicate effectively.
After this had been repeated several times on both sides, and as it was getting more and more dark, those in their native prows at last ceased and paddled off. For more security and to be on guard against all accidents, we ordered our men to keep double watches, as we are wont to do when out at sea, and to keep in readiness all necessaries of war, such as muskets, pikes, and cutlasses. December the 19th. Early in the morning, a boat manned with 13 natives approached to about a stone's cast from our ships. They called out several times, but we did not understand them, their speech not bearing any resemblance to the vocabulary given us by the Honourable Governor-General and Councillors of India. As far as we could observe, these people were of ordinary height. They had rough voices and strong bones.
These people were of ordinary height. I wonder what that would mean at this time. Because remember, over time, people on average have gotten quite a bit taller than they would have been in 1642. So average height from a Dutchman, what are we talking about? Maybe like 5'7", 5'6"? I have no idea. I mean, I'm not keeping track of the sort of average world height over time, nor the average height according to someone from the Netherlands in 1642. But I imagine when he says average height, he does not mean as tall as we would think today.
The colour of their skin being brown and yellow, they wore tufts of black hair right upon the top of their heads, tied fast in the manner of the Japanese at the back of their heads. For clothing, as it seemed to us, some of them wore mats, others cotton stuffs. Almost all of them were naked from the shoulders to the waist. We repeatedly made signs for them to come on board of us, showing them some white linen and some knives that formed part of our cargo. They did not come nearer, however, but at last paddled back to shore. In the meantime, we convened a council and resolved to go as near to the shore as we could, since there was good anchoring around here, and these people apparently sought our friendship. Shortly after we had drawn up this resolution, we saw 7 more boats put off from the shore, one of which, high and pointed in front, manned with 17 natives, paddled round behind the Zeehan, while another, the 13 able-bodied men in her, approached to within half a stone's throw of our ship. The men in these 2 boats now and then called out to each other. We held up and showed them as before white linens, but they remained where they were. The skipper of the Zeehan now sent out to them his quartermaster.
Yeah, this is a real interesting one because, as I pointed out, the level of communication is far less than anything we've seen before. Of course, the languages that each of these people speaks, there is seemingly almost nothing in common between them. They really can't communicate. Maybe over time. But right now, this is a real sort of difficult first meeting, right? It's really hard for both sides to make sense of each other, I imagine. Now, we're only getting the one side of this. We're not getting the Maori perspective, and that would be fascinating to have, but you can imagine they were also sort of bemused, wondering what exactly was happening. They couldn't understand the Europeans, so this is a sort of difficult first meeting.
With her cockboat with 6 paddlers in it, with orders for the second mates that, if these people should offer to come alongside the Zeehan, they should not allow too many of them on board of her. But just as the cockboat of the Zeehan had put off, those in the prow before us, between the 2 ships, began to paddle so furiously towards it that, when they were about halfway slightly nearer to our ship, they struck the Zeehan's cockboat so violently alongside with the stem of their prow that it got a violent lurch, upon which the foremost man in this prow of villains, with a long, blunt pike, thrust the quartermaster in the neck several times with so much force that the poor man fell overboard. Upon this, the other natives with short, thick clubs...
Yeah, this is we're getting a violent first meeting.
...paddles fell upon the men in the cockboat and overcame them by main force, in which fray 3 of our men were killed and a 4th got mortally wounded through the heavy blows. The quartermaster and 2 sailors swam to our ship, which they got into alive. After this outrageous and detestable crime, the murderers sent the cockboat adrift, having taken one of the dead bodies into their prow,
Well, I wonder if the Europeans are going to open fire. Also, I talked about this in the context of the Americas. Also, obviously, sorry, we're very far from the Americas, but the same principle holds, which is when, you have these two peoples meeting for the first time, there can be a lot of different outcomes. We saw in the example of the Aztecs, the Europeans were basically welcomed. There are other examples in which the first meetings were very violent, like we're seeing here, where you can have something in between. I think especially in a situation where neither side understands each other, it's going to be more difficult for it to be peaceful and amicable. But, it's clear that I think the Maori came in with the plan. They were like, all right, we don't know who these guys are. We're going to row up and get them out of here.
And thrown another into the sea. Ourselves and those on board the Hands, seeing this, diligently fired our muskets and guns, and although we did not hit any of them, the two prows made haste to the shore, where they were out of reach of shot.
And that's kind of what I wondered the most. What did those people think about the European firepower, when they started shooting muskets, perhaps cannons from their ships? I so wish we had an account of what exactly was going through the heads of those men, seeing those Europeans fire at them for the first time, because that must have been pretty remarkable. I'm not sure they would entirely understand. Of course, they'd understand some sort of projectile weapon, but a different projectile weapon than they'd ever witnessed before.
We now weighed anchor and set sail, since we could not hope to enter into any friendly relations with these people, or to be able to get water or refreshments here. Having weighed anchor and being under sail, we saw 22 prows near the shore, of which 11, swarming with people, were making for our ships.
Uh-oh.
We kept quiet until some of the foremost were within reach of our guns, and then fired 1 or 2 shots from the gun room without pieces, without, however, doing them any harm. Those on board the Zeehan also fired, and in the largest prow hit a man who held a small white flag in his hand, who fell down. As soon as they had got this volley, they paddled back to shore with great speed. They remained lying near the shore without visiting us any further. Seeing that the detestable deed of these natives against 4 men of the Zeehan's crew, perpetrated this morning, must teach us to consider the inhabitants of this country as enemies. Although this land seems to be a very fine country, and we trust
Van Diemen's Land, or I don't know how to pronounce that. I'm sorry to anybody watching from the Netherlands. But that's what our friend Abel here named it. It was later renamed.
that this is the mainland coast of the unknown South Land.
Wow. I should say later renamed to Tasmania to honor him.
You, O king, live be...
Qianlong's letter to George III of England, 1793. I'm sure my pronunciation on that wasn't great either. So we have the Emperor of China writing to the King of England following the first British embassy to China. So we're having the first official contact between two great empires, the expanding British Empire and, of course, the long-established Empire of China. Now, as we know, in the following decades, that relationship would not go very well. We can look at the Opium Wars. It's basically this narrative of, like I said, the expanding British Empire getting more and more powerful, whereas China stagnates and grows weaker. So we're kind of seeing the origins of a lot of those Chinese relations with the European powers in the 19th century, which was, of course, not a great time for China. They would be taken advantage of by a lot of European powers, probably Britain most of all. So this is an interesting point of contact.
the confines of many seas. Nevertheless, impelled by your humble desire to partake of the benefits of our civilization, you have dispatched a mission respectfully bearing your memorial. Your envoy has crossed the seas and paid his respects at my court on the anniversary of my birthday. To show your devotion, you have also sent offerings of your country's produce. In consideration of the fact that your ambassador and his deputy have come a long way with your memorial and tribute,
Okay, and so once again, we're getting the Chinese perspective here. China sees itself as this great and powerful empire, because it is. It is a great and powerful empire. You know, they see themselves as sort of the center of the world, the greatest empire of the world. And that's how the Brits see and will certainly see themselves in the future. And so what we're getting from Qianlong is he's saying, you know, I very much appreciate you coming so far to pay tribute to me. You know, of course, that's not how the Brits see it. They see it as making diplomatic contact with a power that they probably see as lesser to them. But the Chinese are seeing it as this sort of small island nation from far away coming to pay tribute to them, to their great empire. And by the way, these are some of the issues. This gap in understanding, this difference in perspective that would cause a lot of problems between China and Britain going into the 1800s. Which, like I said, can be seen through things such as the Opium Wars, when Britain would just exercise its will on China, and though China saw itself as this great and powerful empire, it really couldn't manage to resist in any great way.
I have shown them high favor and have allowed them to be introduced into my presence. As to your entreaty to send one of your nationals to be accredited to my celestial court and to be in control of your country's trade with China, this request is contrary to all usage of my dynasty and cannot possibly be entertained. Europe consists of many other nations besides your own. If each and all determined to be represented at our court, how could we possibly consent? The thing is utterly impracticable. How can our dynasty alter its whole procedure and system of etiquette established for more than a century in order to meet your individual views?
Right, and of course we see this difference in customs. You know, to the Europeans, yes, we send envoys and embassies, and the court is filled with a bunch of embassies and envoys from all these different countries. You know, that's just the European way of doing things. But to Qianlong, to the Chinese, they're saying this is absolutely ridiculous. You know, how are we going to do this? We can't have, you know, envoys and embassies dictating trade with us from all of these different nations of Europe. Whereas to the Europeans, they're like, well, of course we can. So once again, we have very much a gap in perspective.
Our dynasty's majestic virtue has penetrated unto every country under heaven, and kings of all nations have offered their costly tribute by land and sea. As your ambassador can see for himself, we possess all things. I set no value.
And to be fair, though, once again, this is sort of I guess you could call it a delusional perspective, seeing yourself as the greatest empire of the world, though, once again, this is a perspective that most global empires hold. The Chinese Empire, the British, especially throughout the 1800s, the Roman Empire back in the day, this is not something unique. But when Macartney and the British Embassy visited China, they certainly would have seen, and I'm sure been impressed by China, you know, the prosperity, the wealth, the amount of people, all of this, you know, like they said, we have everything we need. Now, certainly the Europeans had some things that the Chinese didn't, but, you know, the Chinese were doing pretty well on their own, and they had a lot of stuff that the Europeans didn't. You know, I mean, this is exactly why the Europeans wanted to show up to trade, to get in on some of that great Chinese goods, which they didn't necessarily have access to. So, the Brits probably would have been impressed landing in China.
Value on objects strange or ingenious, and I have no use for your country's manufactures. There was therefore no need to import the manufactures of outside barbarians in exchange for our own produce.
Outside barbarians, once again, this is something that the Romans would do, the great Persian empires would do. They saw everybody but themselves as barbarians. Pretty typical thing. And like Qianlong is saying, you know, we don't need your manufacturers, we're fine with what we have. And this is one of the reasons why the Opium Wars will happen, because Britain's like, well, they don't want any of our manufacturers, they don't want any of our goods, what can we do? Well, let's get the Chinese people addicted to opium, and then they'll have to buy that from us. A pretty twisted logic, but, you know, this is how we end up at that point.
But as the tea, silk, and porcelain which the Celestial Empire produces are absolute...
And that's exactly it. You know, the Brits don't really have anything that the Chinese, or at least the Chinese court, wants. Chinese court is telling them, no, we're fine without your trinkets. But the Chinese, silk, porcelain, tea, they have things that Britain and Europe as a whole very much wants. They want these things very badly. These are consumer goods in extremely high demand. Silk, porcelain, and tea, I mean, my goodness, these are things that there's a strong market for.
Necessities to European nations and to yourselves, we have permitted, as a signal mark of favour, that foreign hongs should be established at Canton.
Right.
Moreover, our dynasty, swaying the myriad races of the globe, extends the same benevolence towards all. Your England is not the only nation trading at Canton. If other nations, following your bad example, wrongfully importune my ear with further impossible requests, how will it be possible for me to treat them with easy indulgence?
And once again, you can see the perspective. Qianlong sees China as the center of the world. Everybody's coming to him. And, we can't do this much for all of you different European nations. So we'll all allow you to come to Canton and you can do your trade there. Bam, blanket policy for everybody. That's fair. But of course, imagine, the Brits getting this letter, British officials, or even George III. I'm not sure if he particularly read this letter, but imagine any of them reading this, seeing themselves as probably the most important country, the most important empire on the map. They would be very offended, thinking, you can't treat us like this, we deserve more. You really think we are that beneath you? Well, we'll show you. Like I said, we can see how British-Chinese relationships would develop throughout the next century, not well. And you can sort of see that groundwork being laid here.
Nevertheless, I do not forget the lonely remoteness of your island, cut off from the world by intervening wastes of sea, nor do I overlook your excusable ignorance of the usages of our celestial empire. Regarding your nation's worship of the Lord of Heaven, it is the same religion as the other European nations. Ever since the beginning of history, sage emperors and wise rulers have bestowed on China a moral system and inculcated a code. There has been no hankering after heterodox doctrines. The distinction between Chinese and barbarian is most strict. And
of course, the Brits, the Europeans, would have found this incredibly offensive as well. The talk of religion, they see, in this case, Protestantism, Anglicanism. But if we're talking about different European powers, it could be Catholicism. Basically, Christianity is the one and only true religion to their perspective. And this is very different than the Chinese perspective. Though, as you can sort of tell from this letter, the Chinese are already familiar with Christianity. They've had people from other European countries, I think especially Dutch explorers, Dutch individuals in China at the Chinese court for a while, even religious figures, Christian religious figures. So they are familiar with this religion that Britain practices, at least more broadly, right? Christianity broadly, maybe not the particulars of the differences between how Christianity is practiced in these different European countries.
Your ambassador's request that barbarians shall be given full liberty to disseminate their religion is utterly unreasonable. It may be, O King, that the above proposals have been wantonly made by your ambassador on his own responsibility, or you yourself are ignorant of the dynastic regulations and had no intention of transgressing them when you expressed these wild ideas and hopes.
Right, so you can see that Qianlong is treating George III as basically an ignorant vassal. A vassal king who is subservient to him, doesn't hold much power, and clearly doesn't understand the proper way of doing things.
And so if, after the receipt of this explicit decree, you lightly give ear to the representations of your subordinates and allow your barbarian merchants to proceed, the ordinances of the Celestial Empire are strict in the extreme. Your merchants will assuredly never be permitted to land or to reside there, but will be subject to instant expulsion. In that event, your barbarian merchants will have had a very long journey for nothing. Do not say that you were not warned in due time. Tremblingly obey, and show no negligence.
Wow.
Remember to follow the link in the description to...
Alrighty, and you can go and check them out and check out their channel and their sponsor. Wow, that was a very interesting video. Very different than what we've done before. Like I said, this was just fully primary sources that had been narrated and visuals added by this channel, Voices of the Past. So a bit different than what we usually do. It was a little tough sometimes to add relevant commentary, but very interesting. You know, I think these primary sources are very important, very relevant, and we do a lot of history videos that, you know, we would call secondary sources on this channel, though I think a lot of the best YouTube history channels bring primary sources into their videos and always tell us where they're getting their information from, but it is good to get a, you know, just full look at a couple of primary sources detailing some of these first contacts. A very broad video, you know, many different instances of first contact here. You know, we went through the Huns and then the Spaniards arriving and meeting the Aztecs from both perspectives. Then we went through New Zealand and the Maori there, and we've ended with China and England. So some very interesting stuff. I had a good time with this one. If you guys enjoyed this video, please leave a like, subscribe, all that good stuff. I hope you guys are having a good day today, and I will see you all again next time. Goodbye.